And whenever you're ready, just let me know.
Yep, we are ready to go.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Kenita Williams and I am very excited to have you join today's Southern Education Leadership Initiative Prospective Fellows webinar. I am the Director of Leadership Development at the Southern Education Foundation and I oversee the SELI program. I know that it's a very busy time for everybody. We're wrapping up semesters, gearing up for the holidays. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for this informational webinar. So just a little bit about the flow of the next hour or so. I will start by giving a brief snapshot of SEF as an organization. That will be followed by an overview of the SELI Fellowship. We will then transition to what I believe to be the most valuable aspect of today's discussion, which is actually hearing from SELI alumni firsthand about their experiences with the fellowship. Then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the application process, and then we'll open it up for a full Q&A session. So one quick note about Q&A. I think at this point, with COVID and the pandemic, everybody is familiar with Zoom and how it works. But just in case, we have a chat function. So as we go along, please, you will be muted because we are recording, but please do put your questions in the chat box. We'll be also monitoring questions along the way, and we'll try to answer those as they arise. And if we don't answer them, make sure to raise them in the Q&A section. So again, I know that we're all very busy and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I will go ahead and have us jump right into it. Next slide, please. So I'll start a little bit about the Southern Education Foundation, which may be a review for some of you and an introduction for others. So SEF was founded in 1867 in the wake of the Civil War, and we were founded for a number of reasons. One, to establish a system of public education for the newly emancipated free people, for African Americans or former slaves in the South. But a little less known, and I think equally as important fact, is that we were founded to really begin to see this notion of uniting Northerners and Southerners behind this notion of providing quality public education for all people, no matter race. So for really over 150 plus years, we've worked on ensuring and fighting for educational equity and access and opportunity for marginalized and underserved communities. So today our mission is to advance creative solutions to ensure equity and excellence in education for students of color and low-income students in the South. We are unapologetically proponents of public education, and we do truly believe that when education is done right, it is the vehicle by which every student gets their chance to develop their full potential and be propelled to the opportunity-rich lives that they deserve. Next slide, please. So a little more about SEF. Here, this figure gives a great snapshot of how SEF operates really along 3 dimensions. First, you will see our continuum. We operate across the entire P16 continuum. We would even say P20, which is starting with early learning, early childhood education, all the way through post-secondary higher education. But I say P20 because we also do some work on the education workforce development, in workforce development in some of our states. So next, you'll see our geography. As you can tell from our name, we are a regional organization and take a regional approach to our work. We operate in 17 states, which includes those which are traditionally considered the American South, plus a few states a little north, so like Delaware, Missouri, and Maryland. And then lastly, that third prong is our strategies. And we really do our work in what I would say are 3 buckets. The first is really our research, which I think we might be a little more known for. And that's really about looking into the trends and the data around education and education equity and disparity in our region and nationally. Our next bucket is advocacy and government affairs, which can take a number of forms. Sometimes that involves building multi-sector collaborations to fight issues. Sometimes it's about equipping coalitions with the tools and information they need to be able to fight against issues. So for instance, our research. And then other times it really is a focus on relationship building with elected officials and educating policymakers on the impact of their legislative and policy choices, particularly on underserved communities. And then lastly, our third strategy, which I lead, and I'll speak about a little more, and obviously the rest of the presentation, is our leadership development. And in a lot of ways, our leadership development is an extension of our advocacy work with a more intentional fellowship model that I'll talk about a little more in the next slides. So next slide, please. So here, I just like to share the slide. I think it's a very interesting, fun fact about SEF. So SEF has a long legacy of leadership development. And really, for the overwhelming majority of our 150 years of existence, we've worked with or to develop the capacity of promising leaders to rise to the challenge and really be at the helm of creating an education system that works for all students, no matter their background. So the fun fact is that here you see picture W.E.B. Du Bois, who is actually one of SEF's very first fellows in 1903. And we played a very prominent role, important role in supporting one of his renowned works, The Souls of Black Folk. So leadership development has really been part and parcel of SEF's DNA, and it's only natural that we will be continuing and be still very intentional about that work today. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to share, before jumping into SELI, a little more about our approach to leadership development, or which is our theory of change, as I call it. And so I say our approach is a double helix, and that, in our opinion, effective leadership development takes a two-strand approach. There's one strand that really works on strengthening personal leadership, and that is really building the individual and personal capacity of a person's racial equity posture. And I define that as their willingness, their commitment, their competencies, their knowledge, skills, and dispositions around really using and exerting their personal influence to impact systems, policies, and practices to be able to facilitate equitable access and opportunities and outcomes for students of color, regardless of race. So you are being able to use your personal and your ability skills to do this. And we help to build that. The second strand that's also occurring simultaneously is really about influencing system change. And so, yes, we're developing you as in your personal leadership dispositions, but we're also about building your understanding and ability to influence the system. And so that thread is about really working with leaders to build their knowledge, awareness, and understanding of what is actually happening in schools and systems. So what does the data say, or what do the data say about the nature and magnitude of disparities in districts, particularly in the South? What are those drivers? And what are those high leverage areas that leaders should really be able to focus on to help us to begin to move the proverbial needle? So next slide, please. So now that you know a little bit about SEF and our approach to leadership development, I'll jump into why you're here and talk about SELI, which is really SEF's longest standing signature program. So the mission of SELI, the Southern Education Leadership Initiative, is to empower the next generation of innovators, thinkers, and leaders to become effective change agents in education. So SELI was developed in 2004, really to mark the 50th anniversary of the landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education. And the belief was that even despite of all the progress, or, progress that has occurred with schools, there was still a lot of work to be done in really fulfilling the promises of Brown and ensuring that all students, irrespective of race, receive an excellent education. So SEF thought that we needed to really help build this pipeline of leaders, particularly in the South, of equity-oriented change agents. That is to say that we wanted to build this new generation of thinkers, of leaders with their big ideas and the hearts to go with it that was needed to carry on the work of Brown. And that is, but these leaders also need to be given the opportunities where they can grow academically and professionally and develop and hone the skills needed to lead this work. Therefore, we created SELI. So now going into 2011, we will go into our 17th year of SELI. And we have provided nearly 250 students with this really unparalleled leadership development opportunity to work directly on education equity issues throughout the South. Through SELI, we have really built this pipeline of talented, diverse young leaders that are now able to really conduct important research, policy analysis, advocacy, community organizing, and do all this work across our region, and have done this with well over 100 just different organizations in the South. The next slide gives you a glimpse of the type of placements where we pair students. And, this is usually a question we place students based on, which I'll talk about more, their ability, their skills, their interests, as well as the needs and capacity of the organization based on the work plan that they offer, all to give the fellows a very meaningful experience. So a little more about our placement sites. You'll see these are our placements from the 2019 fellowship. So our alumni, Asia and Wesley, will talk a little bit more about their placements in a few minutes. But really, SEF places undergraduates, graduates, and doctoral and professional students in an 8-week fellowship program in either school districts, state agencies, institutions of higher education, or nonprofits in the summer, where they do get firsthand experience working on education equity issues, as I just mentioned, and really too to help build the capacity of our partner organizations. So it is a symbiotic relationship. You're developing, but you're also helping the partner organization. So last summer we had fellows work at a number of places across the South. We had one at the Georgia Department of Education. We had one at UNCF, United Negro College Fund. We had a fellow at an institution of higher education, Virginia Union, working on accreditation issues, and school districts of the South, Gwinnett County and DeSoto ISD in Texas. And so you'll see also that they're working across a number of issues, from early learning, college access, social justice, some in the philanthropic space. Again, like I said, I typically get questions about how the formula for this placement. And again, it's based on a number of things, but at a high level, it's based on the fellow's interest, their current skill set, so the skills that they actually bring, our current slate of partners, because that does change a little each summer, and what the partner organization needs. So what types of skills and supports they need to get the work done. And so lastly, what I'll say before going to the next slide is this: because SELI is a paid fellowship, we bring in a tremendously talented group of young leaders. Like I just can't say that enough. And our fellows are very highly coveted. So a lot of organizations want them. We see SELI as an opportunity to help build the talent pipeline for young leaders in the South, as I mentioned earlier, that start their careers with an equity orientation or orientation for social justice, so that they are attuned to equity issues from the very beginning. We also see SELI as an opportunity to stop the brain drain in the South. We need our young leaders to remain in the South. We just need you. And we also see this as an opportunity to really expose our rising and emerging leaders to various careers or opportunities, various careers opportunities in education. Like we want more people to see education as a viable career option, and that it's not just going to be a teacher or a principal. There are so many other things that you can do in the education space. So next slide, please. So a little bit about program logistics. This is not an exhaustive list, but highlights some of the major components. Again, fellows are placed with a partner organization based on the proposed projects and the fellow skill set and interest. And the placement is for 8 weeks. You see here, it's tentatively scheduled for March 24th, the placement March 24th through July 16, 2021. I say tentatively, which I'll talk a little bit about because obviously we're still living in a whole pandemic. So that has implications for how we do this. All fellows do work full-time 40-hour weeks in their placement site. So this is a full-time employment opportunity. The goal is to work through a work plan that's presented by the partner site, which the fellows do get to review before agreeing to the placement. And the projects can include a number of things. It can include doing research, white papers, data collection, helping prepare legislation. It could just run the gamut. You could be doing communications. You can be out in the community doing community organizing. There's so many opportunities that fellows can do. We are clear, though, what I really want to say is that we are very clear with our placement sites that this is not an administrative assistant. Like, the fellow is not there to do administrative work the entire summer, making copy, running copies, all of that stuff. Don't get me wrong, we all do that. I still, even at my level, still do those type of things when my president needs those things, but that is not the purpose of this fellowship. It is to be a meaningful, skill building, knowledge building opportunity. And our partners do honor this. In addition to the 8 weeks, fellows will attend both an orientation to kick off the fellowship and a closing. So the orientation serves as sort of a primer for the summer, exposing the fellows to social justice issues in education, really understanding what's happening in terms of the data and the policy, also having an opportunity to hear from kind of thought leaders in the space and advocates that are really working on change. So really just getting a full grounding into what we are hoping you are able to glean from this summer. You and the orientation, you leave to go from your orientation directly to the placement sites. And the orientation is tentatively scheduled for March 19 through 21. And that is an in-person orientation traditionally, again, thinking through contingencies for COVID, and we'll be able to speak more about that. But generally it is an in-person. You come to Atlanta and spend a few days with me to start the orientation. And then after you go to your placement site, and then after your placement is done, you come back to me in Atlanta to do the closing meeting, where you will really come share your lessons learned, reflect on your summer experience, and really think about how you want to carry the work forward and how SEF can continue to support you in doing that. And right now that is scheduled for July 21st and 23rd through 23rd next summer. So it's important to note that orientation and closing and the full 8-week fellowship in person are required. If you cannot do those things, you are not eligible for the fellowship. You know, sometimes there are case-by-case situations where we need to maybe shift the 8 weeks to accommodate some things. We do that on a case-by-case as needed, but you have to commit to orientation, closing, and 8 weeks. And that is a non-negotiable. And I want to note that SEF will cover the travel and lodging for associated with going to the orientation and the closing and to your placement sites. Very important note, as I mentioned a few times, because I think this is important for folks, is that SELI is, again, a paid opportunity. Undergraduates receive a stipend of $4,500 and graduate professional degree students receive $5,000. And so, but while I want to make this clear too, because questions do arise, while we do cover your travel expenses to and from orientation and closing and to and from your placement site, the student is responsible for living expenses and transportation expenses while at your placement site, and that's why you're offered the stipend. And generally, our placement hosts are able to work with students to find very low cost housing, so it's not really exorbitant cost, but the student or the fellow is responsible for that. So next slide. So just a little bit about eligibility, just some general guidelines. As I said before, we do make exceptions on a case-by-case basis, but this is generally the guidelines that we subscribe to or adhere to for eligibility for SELI. So SELI is for students. I just want to say that again, it is for students. So you need to be a student. So you should be enrolled in an undergraduate degree or a graduate professional level program. So that could be a doctorate, a master's, law school, a number of different undergrad degrees. Sometimes we do have recent graduates that we will accept on a case-by-case basis. So we don't want anyone to not apply because they're graduating, but generally those graduates also have plans to pursue their education, to continue to pursue educational opportunities. So, but I say that to say, don't not apply just because you're graduating. Definitely reach out to me regarding whether you're eligible and whether you should apply. Generally, because this is for emerging rising leaders, we look at leaders, students between the ages 20 to 35 years old to qualify for the program. Age is generally a guideline. The most important, I would say, is that the hours and credits in school. To be eligible for SELI, you need to be equivalent of a junior. So you have to have completed both your freshman and sophomore years by the time your placement starts. So you just need to have completed that. We accept all majors, but obviously do prefer those majors that are related to social justice, equity issues, and education policy and practice, those type of majors. Writing is critical, and being able to, think critically. So the application does try to probe some of that. So those things do matter in your eligibility. And then, so I'll talk more about the application at the end, but here it is noted that application should be submitted by March 1st, 2021. And that eligibility, again, you need to be able to agree to be at your placement site. Like I said, I'm thinking through contingencies for COVID, but generally speaking, SELI is not a remote placement. You need to agree to be with your placement site. And also, I have note that we ask in the application for a willingness to relocate to another city in the South. We try as much as possible. I try to, take into consideration life circumstances and place as needed, but placements are based on our partner sites and based on the skill set. So you may need to relocate to another state in the South for the 8 weeks to be able to find a good match. So be willing to do that. And also very critical is the willingness to not take on other obligations like coursework, LSAT prep, any of those type of things, other jobs, anything that is really going to be competing with your ability to focus and commit to our placement site. And so that is it on what I will share with that. Next slide. Okay, so I'll move into what I feel is the most valuable experience of our Prospective Fellows webinar, and that's the opportunity to hear from alumni on their experiences. So for the next several minutes, you can go to the next slide, from two of my absolute favorite SELI fellows ever. I love all my fellows, but they are some of my favorites, just on their experiences from last summer. And so I think I know that they will share their experience, and I think you'll be able to get a good understanding of what it's like to be a fellow and be able to ask them some of your questions. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Asia. So they will introduce themselves, tell you more about themselves, but we're going to hear from Asia Johnson and Wesley Smith, and they both were in our 2019 cohort. So without further ado, I will turn it over.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's good to see all the faces. Some I know, some I don't. But my name is Asia Johnson, and I was, like Kanita said, a fellow for the 2019 summer, and I know Wes very well. And I was placed in DeSoto Independent School District in DeSoto, Texas. I was also the Jenny Looney Servant Leader Award winner, which is something Kanita will get into you all when the time comes. So when I applied to the program, I had just graduated from Howard with my master's in education policy, and I was entering a doctoral program at USC to get my doctorate in education. So I was one of those people who Kanita was talking about, like if you just graduated, but you have plans to further your educational career, she will, consider you. So I thank you for that, Kanita. And so I applied to SELI because I wanted to advance equity in the South, but also start to erase that narrative that like the South is just like a brain drain and that there's nothing that comes out of the South but like ridiculousness. I believe that the South is honestly like the pulse of the culture. And when you invest in it and you really take your time in the South, you can come up with really great things, which is what SELI does. So we can go to the next slide. So working in DeSoto, Texas, I was in their school district. And so I worked with the chief academic officer and the superintendent very closely, who was also a Rellin Fellow and knows Kanita. But I worked with them very closely to help create equitable solutions for the district. DeSoto was under like a lot of turnover. They had just fired their previous superintendent for like mismanaging funds. They had to cut like 98 positions. They closed the school and they were at an F rating. So I really hit the ground running to see how we could like change the trajectory of the school district by the end of my 8 weeks to not only keep positions, but also to switch their rating from an F rating to a higher grade because the state of Texas was going to fold them into another school district. And so the greatest challenges were organizational culture. They had none, and there was a lot of distrust within like the district and families and communities within the district. No one trusted each other. There was a lot of nepotism. Another challenge was like reversing financial mismanagement, helping them get equitable practices and policies in place, switching low student and district performance, and then the idea of possibly closing the district and folding it into Dallas Independent School District. So we can go to the next slide. So I worked on a lot of things in the summer. And when Kanita says like you hit the ground running, you seriously hit the ground running. And so you have to have that like stamina and motivation to want to make these changes, because I was giving 2 really big projects. The first one was to restructure the student code of conduct to make it more equitable and inclusive. And then the other was restructuring the DeSoto's hiring process to be more cohesive. Both things that are policy related, but also directly tied and impacted to helping students achieve the best educational experiences that they can in DeSoto. So we can go on to the next one. So for the student code of conduct, a lot of the policies that were in place they weren't equitable, they weren't inclusive, they were very, very punitive, instead of more like restorative. So for example, one of the, this was like an 80-page document. So I spent 8 weeks going through an 80-page document, looking at everything that was wrong and suggesting ways to make it right, so to speak. So the first thing was the student code of conduct. And if you can see, the code of conduct hadn't been touched in 3 years. So it was a lot that had to be rewritten and unpacked. And so instead of all these dress code violations, and that were like very punitive, we just switched it to make it more like streamlined. You won't get expelled from school for wearing a belt if you don't need to wear a belt. Like, it's just very inclusive and understanding, because a lot of what was happening in DeSoto was that there was like, privilege and classism, and a lot of that was happening. And so by going into the code of conduct, we were able to make the experiences of students better. So we can go to the next slide. And so one of the biggest things that I really fought for, like to my very last day actually, was getting corporal punishment taken out of the code of conduct. So in Texas, you can practice corporal punishment. And so with the new superintendent and his new cabinet that he brought in, which were all millennials, so that should be people talk about millennials, but we're making changes, y'all. He really wanted to get corporal punishment out, and the district was like, no, it's like, we're keeping it in. So I worked with the chief academic officer to come up with disciplinary guidelines that said the district will not participate in corporal punishment. We don't believe in it. We won't participate in it. And instead we will do a more structured restorative approach to addressing student misbehavior. And so as you can see, we took it out, and I'm happy to say that the district accepted it. And I checked the other day, it's still in the code of conduct. So all the changes I lifted up are in the code of conduct still. So we go to the next slide. Oh, and then the hiring process. So before I came on, there was actually no hiring process. It was just more like, hey, you're so-and-so's auntie. you can teach art, and that's not how that should go. So again, I sat down and I streamlined an interview process, especially for like highly visible positions within the district, like director positions or principal positions, that was actually a step-by-step process that went through varying levels of like acceptance until you got to the final in-person interview, which was like sitting in front of your peers, and then they would grade you. And then if you passed that, it had to go to the superintendent versus going to the superintendent first and then working backwards. So I'm happy to say that they accepted that too. And they actually hired 3 people that summer from doing this interview process. And we can go to the next one. Oh, that's it. Oh, one more thing I wanted to add. The biggest thing I learned from being a SELI fellow is that whatever you're doing, nothing is too small. So like Kenita was saying, like making the copies, like, yes, we all will have to make copies, but what you're doing is directly tied to like helping the South be equitable and getting access and opportunities for students in the South. So don't think like, oh, I'm sitting here, I have to make 35 copies of something. It's like, yeah, you're making 35 copies of something because that needs to be made, because 35 people need to find out about this flyer or this program that your placement site is putting on. And honestly, equity is needed everywhere, and it also looks very different. So what I did in my placement site is super different than what Wes did, but it's tied to the same common goal, which is getting the South on the map as this like educational cultural hub.
Thank you, Asia. So we will have a full Q&A session, but I will, if someone has a very pressing question for Asia right now, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I might ask you a question before we move on to Wesley. So we actually just had one in the box. Were you responsible for making changes to the code yourself, or did you work with others?
So it was actually really cool because, and Kenita talks about this, like your level of skill set, the chief academic officer trusted me enough to do the first run at it. And then she came behind me and was like, oh, we can't do that, or we can't do this. So it was a mixture of yes and no. Like a lot of what I did come up with on my own made it into the final version of the code of conduct. But then if there were areas about policy that I didn't know, she came in and like added her 2 cents to it.
We have one more question. What were your personal and professional goals, expectations before entering the program? And did the fellowship measure up to those goals? These are very good questions. Thank you, too. Right.
So like in my head, I was thinking like, oh, I didn't hit on that.
Yes.
So I really was interested in like DEI work and social justice work, especially in the realm of education for Black and Brown students. And I was doing diversity work in DC before I went to my placement site, and working in DeSoto and actually putting my hands on the policies and procedures that would directly impact that group of learner that I was interested in, definitely lived up to it. And the work I do now, so now I live in Los Angeles, and I'm an outreach director at an education organization that basically helps create the policies and procedures for students in Los Angeles. And so it definitely has given me that DEI, motivation that I wanted, but also the social justice industry that I wanted to go into, while all still being under the education umbrella. So like Kenita said, you don't have to just be a teacher or a principal or an AP. Like you can be a policy analyst. You can work in communications and still do education.
Thank you so much, Asia. So I have one question before we turn it over to Wesley. Why would you recommend that everyone on the call applies to SELI this year?
So even going to this PowerPoint, I'm like, I want to reapply. I can't. I think everyone on this call should apply to SELI this year, because I think now more than ever, we definitely need change makers and thought leaders doing this work, especially in the South. And if you want 8 weeks of your life that are not only going to change your future, but change the future of students all over the South, I cannot recommend more to apply. SELI opened so many doors for me that I didn't think would even open had I not had SCF on my resume, or been like, oh, I know, Kenita and Reagan, or like, the superintendent I work with, we still keep in contact to this day. So I definitely think that if you are ready to really do hard work and you're really ready to make lasting changes for generations to come, you should apply as soon as you get off this call.
And I promise you, I did not pay her to give that answer. Thank you so much. So I will now turn it over to Wesley.
All right. Thank you all. I'm so excited to be with you, and I have quite the act to follow with Asia, but that's okay. So yes, I'm Wesley Smith. My placement was with Unify Ed in Chattanooga. Reagan, you can go to the next slide. So before talking about what I did, I think it's helpful, especially for prospective fellows, to talk about where I was 2 years ago when I was in your chair, right? So like it seems like forever, especially because this year has been forever, but that was only 2 years ago. And for many of you on this call, I'm probably younger than you. I was a sophomore when I applied, so I would have been a junior, like I was a rising junior right at that minimum age requirement, but I shot my shot, so to speak, and I was like, I think I'm qualified for this and would learn a lot from this. But before I get into that, it's important to, I think, start with an orientation of what home is and why stuff like this matters. So I spent the first 18 years of my life in Nashville. I graduated from Metro Nashville Public Schools. Here is not my graduating class, but a graduating class from my high school walking down Broadway. So to give you some orientation, like that's where my high school was. This is Bridgestone Arena here right in the middle where the Predators play. The picture on the left is a long story, but let's just say I'm superstitious. But grew up in Nashville, love Predators hockey and all kind of the stuff that comes with it, and really loved my high school experience. And it was a public school experience, like I said. But, you know, I was exposed to so many different ideas and people from different backgrounds. It's a magnet school. And so we pulled from all over Davidson County, the second biggest county in Tennessee. And just, I can't like go on about it enough that my high school experience was amazing. And so I came into college. I go to the University of Tennessee. I'm a senior there now, or here now. But I came into college and I said, I want to really dig into education policy. I really want to focus on this. I thought, and still in many ways think that education is a silver bullet, that if you can provide equity in education, that solves so many systemic issues in the country. And I was also exposed early in college to this idea of community schools that my mentor has really taken off with here in Knoxville. And that's something that I learned through the application process that SELI and SEF also were big supporters of, which, if you're unfamiliar, is basically a whole child approach to education and also a whole community approach to education. So centering schools in the education experience. So that's where I was as a sophomore. And I was like, wow, I'm really young for this. And there's people like Asia who have finished their master's programs, or others that had, you know, their JDs. And so if that's you, I would just want to let you know, don't let that stop you, because the diversity of the program from background and age and experience is really what makes it, in my opinion. So next slide. I was placed with Unify Ed in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And my experience was different from Asia's in the sense that Asia was very much working in the system, and I was working outside the system trying to influence the system. And so it was a very different culture, a very different dynamic, and one that I loved, but one that I think if I could do it again, would do a lot differently. So here's just kind of a snapshot of the work that I did. I was primarily in charge of redoing their Building Power for Change workshop, which is like an intro for new members into Unify Ed, folks that want to get involved in the community organizing and the advocacy piece. Here in the top right, I'm advocating directly to the county commission, where we were trying to pass a budget that allocated more money to the schools, to teacher raises, to mental health supports, to restorative justice, all that stuff. And then I also worked on other workshops throughout the summer. These are these three things are all things that I had produced as part of a workshop. So we talked a lot about narrative, as you can see on the left, and kind of like the duality of the South, from racist segregationist governors like George Wallace to Rosa Parks, but also like the different levels of Rosa Parks' story, right? That was intentional, that it was Rosa Parks, that became the center of the movement with the boycott and not somebody else. And so just we did a lot, and we talked about power and power with and building people power in our advocacy. And we did a lot of good, and we came up short on some things. So you can go to the next one, Reagan. I think I get into that. Yeah, so lessons learned is so many. First, the power of coalition building. That was where Unify Ed's strength was in coalition building. And so a few things here. This is their full staff, or at the time that I worked there. Their full paid staff was 8 people, all extremely talented, all having to do so much. Like everyone at Unify Ed makes copies. They're, even the president and execs, so to speak. They were working at the time on the Action Plan for Educational Excellence, APEX project. And as I mentioned, trying to get that budget vote passed. And unfortunately, we came up 1 vote short. As you can see there, it was very political. It became very politicized. The 3 Democrats voted for it, 1 Republican voted for it, but we just couldn't get that 1 other Republican to swing over. And that gets me into my second, or my last 2 points about controlling the narrative. That in the South, even in your big cities, like Chattanooga is a bigger city, not an Atlanta by any means, but even in your urban areas, it's about controlling the narrative. If you're working for justice, if you're working for equity, you can very easily be painted as a socialist or a communist or whatever. And you have to fight that and talk about what it is that you're for, which is equity and justice in these spaces. And that was something we struggled with, was losing that narrative. People knew who Unified Ed were. They knew that we were, big advocates for this stuff. And then the last thing is pick your battles. I think, admittedly, I wasn't in a position to say this as a fellow, that they were fighting on too many fronts at once with the staff that they had. And had they put more resources into the budget vote and more strategy, then maybe we would have won. And money allows, a lot of those other things to happen more easily. So those are the lessons from that. And then personal lessons, there was a lot of career clarity. I've changed my focus now from education policy to community development in a broader sense. And I really pull this quote from Franklin Pierce, the president of SEF, that he told us in before we left the program, that not all educators are teachers, that you don't even have to even really be in the field of education. But like Kanita said, SELI gave me that orientation of equity work and justice work rooted in the South, which I think is especially important. And so these are just some examples. Andre Perry here on the left, who does an amazing job. He's a Metropolitan Policy Fellow at Brookings, and he's kind of had a similar career trajectory, albeit he's, does much more serious stuff than me, but expanding education policy into a more community development approach and talking about, housing equity and food equity and all these other things. And then this book by Ainsley Erickson was a huge impact on me, Making the Unequal Metropolis, so that schools are both pawns in this game of equity and inequity in the city, but also strategic players in it, and just being more aware of that. So last slide here is why you should apply. There's so many reasons, like Asia said, just being here, I want to do it all over again. But the number one thing, without a doubt, for me, is the peer network that you have. Especially for me, being one of the younger members of SELI, to have folks like Asia that I really see as like role models, give you advice but also give you confidence. I mean, the whole time your peers are telling you like, wow, that was so great. I want to hear your perspective on this. And that, from a confidence perspective, especially if you're an undergrad, cannot be understated. And it is such a unique experience, as Kanita was speaking towards. I love the South. I think the brain drain of the South is a serious issue. And so being a participant in SELI is huge, because you're working to undo that. And also just all the professional opportunities to have that on your resume, but to also have real legitimate experience where you're going to make mistakes and you're going to learn, but you're in a environment where you're encouraged to take risks, you're encouraged to learn and to grow throughout the process. And so I can't speak highly enough about it.
Thank you, Wesley. I guess you guys can see why these two are my faves, or some of my faves. Quick question. You do have actually a question in the box, Wesley. It says, how did SELI prepare you to lead at such a young age? And how did the fellowship help you understand academic inequities and your role as an ally to Black people and people of color? So that was a lot. It is in the box if you want to look at it.
Yes, great question, Calvert.
It is a great question.
So I'm actually gonna start with the second piece of trying to be an aspiring ally. So UT Knoxville, if you're unfamiliar, despite being an SEC school, is a relatively white school. Is much whiter than the high school that I attended. So the biggest thing for me with SELI that I immediately noticed and loved coming in was the diversity of students from state schools, from HBCUs, we had some private schools as well, non-HBCU private schools. And to have that experience for an aspiring ally was incredible. That's not an experience that I would have had otherwise. Because it also helped me to come back to UT, and even with friends that working on equity issues here, it was like, oh wait, we don't have to, as a PWI, we can look towards HBCU examples as to things that we can do. And honestly, I think a lot of the SELI experience, we just elected our first African-American woman to student body president this past year. She's a good friend of mine, and I helped her a lot in her campaign. And a lot of that was like lessons that I learned from SELI. So it's just like, again, the confidence that comes from that, and the orientation. They give you a great orientation. You're prepared, and Kanita is really going to match you well with an organization that fits your skills, I think, is the biggest thing. That's why I was able to do good work. And again, like, a lot of stuff I would do differently, and that's okay.
But by design, it is a learning experience. And so you should be, if you go imperfect and make no mistakes, then you shouldn't be part of SELI. Like, it is to grow you as a professional. And so, it's great to hear that you all are, transformed after this experience. Wesley, you have one more question that I'll address or ask you to address before we go into the full, my last slide in the full Q&A. And it says, I'm assuming that because of your young age, how did you get some of your older counterparts to be open and cooperate productively for the cause? And so I'm guessing that's specifically about your work at Unify Ed.
Yes, that's how I interpret it too. That's a great question. I was lucky that Unify Ed, I was definitely the youngest person there, but they had another intern through another fellowship that was about my age. And really the staff was relatively young, all things considered, as it can be in the nonprofit world. So I think, I was very fortunate. I thought that my coworkers at Unify Ed were very well oriented to the cause, as you say. Again, I think there was perhaps a disconnect with, just being realistic as to like how much we can get done and what's really moving people. That's mainly where the disconnect was. I don't think there was really a disconnect in terms of equity work or those things, but from perhaps a lack of historical knowledge on how to make change in the South. And that's something that I wish I would have pushed more. that we have a model. The civil rights movement to me is a model. And it was a lot of white leadership. And of course, I'm a white person. There was a lot of white leadership at Unify Ed. And I think if I could go back, it would be kind of pushing a more grassroots, community oriented, even more so than they already had, kind of approach to that. And that's not young people, that's leaning on, right, like the people that came before us and that have done this work. So I don't know, that's a very good question. I hope I answered it. I don't know. It's tough. Yeah.
I think you did a good job answering it, Wesley, and it is a very good question. All the questions have been fantastic. It really it heartens me to see what I have in store with my applications. But I'll just also add to Wesley's answer is that I think, or I want to underscore the reputational capital of SEF and SELI fellows, that you're going into these organizations with people having high expectations to you to be contributing to the organization. So they're looking for you to be a thought partner. They're looking for you to really, like, you're not going in to be a cowering flower. Like, you're going in to really contribute to these organizations. So so go in with the mindset that, you know, obviously some humility, obviously some understanding that you don't know it all and learn, but go in with the thought that I'm here to contribute and I should speak up. So I'll just add that. So before we go into Q&A, there's one more slide that all I'm saying is go ahead and apply today. You have heard from two of our alum on reasons why you should apply. The application is live now. It's on our site, southerneducation.org. It is, and the reason I put this slide because I want to emphasize the importance of putting your best foot forward and presentation, and really this application does really determine if you are going to be selected or not. And so, you know, make sure your resume is in good shape, transcripts, you know, there isn't a GPA requirement, but it also helps us just, you know, document I can't think of the word right now, but basically to see if you are the level of student that you say that you are in terms of year in school. Verify, there we go. And also 2 letters of recommendation. I want to say these recommendations, please ask people who know you and can speak to your strengths and what you can contribute to an organization. Because when you ask people who don't know you, we can tell, and it doesn't help make your case, a compelling case for you to be selected. This is a highly competitive organization and fellowship. And so we have some very strong applicants. And so I'll be very candid to say that if you give me a letter of recommendation from someone that's a president of an organization because you think that looks better, but they can't really speak to you, or they can only say 3 or 4 lines from a very generic form, that does less for someone who might, you know, just be a professor at your school, but knows you well and can really speak to your strengths. So be thoughtful about who you ask for your letters of recommendation. Personal essays, there are some short answer questions that you'll have to answer around kind of equity issues. What do you think are the biggest issues in the South? What's, you know, what drives you about education? Definitely make those good. They give me an idea of your writing and your thought process. But more than anything, like, do not turn in essays with errors. Like those, you have to be thoughtful about those type of things. It's about presentation is equally as important as the content of these things. So I just wanted to emphasize that so that you are making your application as strong as possible. And then 3 references, I will be calling references to learn a little bit more about your experience. So be thoughtful about who you list for those. And you submit all your materials to the SELI at southerneducation.org. And they are due March 1st. And I would say get them in early if you can. The earlier the better. And I think that's it for my part. Reagan, I think the next slide is just Q&A. Yep. So we have about 5 or so minutes for some question and answer for any questions that have not been answered yet. So feel free to unmute and chime in. And Reagan, if you could monitor those as well. So can references be the same as those who wrote your letters of recommendation? Yes, they can, absolutely. So that was 2 questions. I answered that. So yes, they can be the same people. In fact, it probably makes sense that if you know someone that can really speak to your strengths and why you would be an asset to the program, that they serve as both.
I imagine this would be for Wesley and or Asia. How are you applying the skills and knowledge you have gotten from your placements to the work you are currently doing?
So feel free, either of you, to jump in.
I can jump in on that to start. So how I'm applying the skills that I learned from my summer in DeSoto to my current position, it actually gave me a really clear understanding, and Wesley touched on it, about like how I worked in the system, but how also the system can work with those outside of the system. So it really gave me a clear understanding on how to strategically like build up an internal system, but then also rely on external factors to kind of push certain initiatives or policies or narratives through to the school district that maybe wouldn't have been able to be even like thought of if we didn't have like the Urban League behind us, or if we didn't have like, you know, the LA Teachers Union pushing our narrative too.
Yeah, all I'll add to that is that coming out of SELI, you will be in situations where you are much more qualified than you would have been previously, and learning how to, you got to meet people where they're at, and that's a tricky thing, especially being still an undergrad and me having had that experience. But now being involved in community organizations and stuff, like, you have that knowledge, that experience, so to use it. And for my case, it's with community organizing and with narrative and with building power for change, people power. So yeah.
All right, we have maybe time for one more.
There was a question
ahead,
about
Reagan.
if does it have to be a resume or CVs acceptable as well?
Yes, both are acceptable. Generally at the age or experience of SELI, fellows, they're typically more resumes than CVs, but both are acceptable.
And the question about, do you require the sharing of financial information / FAFSA? We do not. Is there direct support or trainings for fellows throughout the 8 weeks at the site?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there is, like, there will be an onboarding process. Every site should be onboarding you based on what they need you to do. But there is not, like, SELI, I just want to be clear, SELI is not a training program per se. Like, you are matched with these sites because you are already going in with a certain level of skills. So you will have some onboarding and training to be grounded in the culture, the needs of the organization. And if they are asking you to do a very new skill, your site should be giving you the training that you need. And my fellows know I'm very protective of them. If you are not getting that, then I need to know that so I can make sure that your site is upholding their end of the partnership. Next slide, Reagan. There you go. How should we reach out to you for questions? So you can reach out to me directly. I think that's my phone number. I think that's my office line, and it will come to my email if I miss the call. But definitely reach out to me, Kay Williams, at southerneducation.org, and also the SELI email that we have. Reagan, we'll share it when we share the slides and post this, but you can go to our website and get any information that you need, but that's directly, and you'll hear from either Reagan or me with an answer.
Can I have one more thing to add, if that's okay?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, like, one last pitch to, like, apply today. If you're ready to, like, do it and do it scared, apply to this program, because you get a lot of big projects, you get a lot thrown at you, but it is so worth it. And solving for equity in the South isn't linear. You have to be creative and open and throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that's what I picked up from like both what Wes and I were saying. So if you're ready to do that, please do not wait till March 1st to send in your application. Like apply, and it'll literally change your life and change the life of students in the South. And she didn't tell me to say that. You did not tell me to say that.
I did not.
I love SELI.
Yeah. But I think that is the most apropos way for us to just close it, because I can't say anything more. So you have heard it from our alum, and I am looking forward to hearing from you and receiving and reading your applications. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. What I didn't say is I don't want to volunteer Wesley or Asia at all if you all have any questions, but is it okay that they reach out to you, and maybe we'll post the slides for this, and we'll add, if it's okay, to add your contact information in there, if it's okay.
Absolutely.
You can send me a behind the scene notes if you're like, just say, no, I don't know, Kenita.
Absolutely.
Okay. But thank you both for being a resource and joining us today and sharing your story. And thank you all for joining. I want to wish everyone a very happy holiday season, and I look forward to receiving and reading your applications. Thank you.